My name is Nora Ashford. I'm 35, a home health nurse, and the morning after the earthquake swallowed my apartment, my mother stood in a doorway I'd carried a key to for 19 years and told me there was no room inside it for my 9-year-old daughter. Not we're full. Not give us a few days. She looked at Ren, then at me, and said 4 words, not with the child. I didn't argue. I didn't beg on that porch. I said, understood, turned around, and walked my daughter back to the car. Here's what nobody in that house knew yet. For 19 years I had been the reason that house still stood upright, the gutters, the taxes, the pillboxes lined up like soldiers every Sunday. And over the next 3 days, what I did made my mother stand in her own dark kitchen at 2 in the morning, pressing that same key back into my palm, asking me to come home. What happened on the 3rd night, after the ground cracked open a second time? I still don't know if any of us walked away from it whole. If you've ever had to hold your ground with people who share your blood, stay with me, because this story starts with a locked door and ends with a key nobody would touch. The quake hit on a Tuesday for 12 in the afternoon, late September. I was changing a dressing on a patient's calf out on County Road 9 when the floor rolled beneath my knees like the deck of a boat. 6.3, they told us later. In a town like Millbrook, that number doesn't mean anything until it means every plate you own is on the kitchen floor. I finished taping the wound, told my patient to sit tight, and drove straight for the elementary school with hands steadier than they had any right to be. Nursing does that. Panic becomes a luxury reserved for people who aren't the ones holding the gauze. Ren was on the blacktop with her class, backpack clutched to her chest. When she spotted me, she didn't run. She walked fast, chin lifted, the way she does when she's decided she isn't allowed to be scared in front of me. 9 years old and already managing my emotions for me. We drove to our building on Delaney Street and stood on the sidewalk looking up. It was still standing, barely. A seam ran from the 2nd floor window straight down through the brick like a signature nobody asked for. That was our floor. A firefighter waved the block back and said nobody would be sleeping inside that night. So we slept in the car. Ren curled under my work jacket in the back seat, her tin of collected stones tucked against her side like a stuffed animal. I sat up front and did the only thing I know how to do under pressure: triage. Airway. Breathing. Shelter. We were alive. We were together. And by morning, an inspector with a roll of colored tags would decide the shape of our entire year. The tag came back red. Not yellow, limited entry. Red. This building can kill you. 15 minutes inside, 1 escort, 1 flashlight, grab what you can carry. I've packed for emergencies my whole career, so I didn't waste a second of it standing still. Ren's stone tin. Her school clothes. My scrubs. Our folder of documents. The framed photo of her at the beach at age 2. The inspector, kind in that tired way, told me I was calmer than most people he'd walked through that day. I told him to give it time. Then I sat in the car and started making calls. 12 hotels between Millbrook and the interstate, 12 versions of the same sentence, fully booked. Insurance adjusters, utility crews, 1,100 families with tags just like mine on their doors. FEMA lodging takes days to activate after a declaration. The woman on the helpline was gentle about it, which somehow made it land harder. My coworker Priya had a couch, but Priya also had a yellow tag, a mother-in-law, and 2 dogs crammed into a 2-bedroom. I kept my voice light for Ren's sake and worked the list like a chart, line by line, name by name. Nothing. The sun dropped low, and the gymnasium at Millbrook High opened as a Red Cross shelter, and I felt the word forming before Ren even said it, the way you feel a fever rising behind a patient's eyes before the thermometer confirms it. Are we going to Grandma's? She asked, leaning between the seats. Simple question. 15 minutes east. 4 bedrooms. A porch swing. A woman who irons her dish towels. And something behind my ribs pulled tight like a suture cinching closed, because the honest answer to my daughter's simple question was a complicated thing no 9-year-old should have to learn. My parents' house had come through the quake exactly the way my mother comes through everything, undented, composed, certain of its own rightness. Dale and Miriam Ashford, 118, Larch Avenue. Chimney straight. Windows intact. Flag out front barely crooked. I parked in the driveway I'd learned to ride a bike in, And for 1 week second I let myself imagine it, Ren in my old room, pancakes in the morning, a door that locked between my daughter and the cold. I knocked. My mother answered in her good cardigan, because even mid-disaster Miriam Ashford dresses for an audience. Her eyes went to Ren first. I watched the whole transaction happen, the flick, the assessment, something closing behind her face like a shop pulling its shutters. Then she looked at me. Nora. Thank God you're all right. I told her about the red tag, that we needed somewhere for a week, maybe 2. She glanced back into that house, all that empty square footage, a sewing room nobody sewed in, and then said, in the same flat tone she uses to decline a second helping. You can stay. Just not with the child. There's no space for her. No space. In a 4-bedroom house with 1 occupied bedroom and a den full of exercise equipment nobody used. Behind her, at the end of the hall, my father stood half in shadow holding a dish towel. He looked at me. He said nothing at all. Ren was 10 feet away in the car, watching through the windshield, reading lips the way kids read everything we think we've hidden from them. I didn't beg. Begging belonged to an older version of me, one who still believed this door had a price I hadn't yet paid. I said, understood, and walked back to the car on steady legs, buckled my seatbelt like it was any ordinary Tuesday, and started the engine. Ren stayed quiet until the stop sign at the end of the block. Then, in a voice she kept deliberately small, Mom, what did Grandma mean? Here's what she meant. And it didn't start on that porch. Ren was born in March, 9 years ago, 6 pounds even, her father gone since the 5th month of the pregnancy, a good laugh and a bad habit of disappearing, and I made my peace with that a long time ago. My parents never did. It wasn't him they held against me. It was the paperwork. No ring, no wedding, no story my mother could tell the ladies at church without lowering her voice. She visited the hospital exactly once. Stood on the far side of the nursery glass, looked at her granddaughter for the length of a single held breath, and never asked to hold her. After that, the rules arrived the way rules always arrive in families like mine, never announced, just quietly enforced. Sunday dinner, standing invitation, 1 chair. Come alone, it's easier. Birthday cards addressed to me and me only, 9 years running. Christmas gifts with my name on the tag and never once my daughter's. I used to test the boundary. Bring Ren to the door on Easter and watch my mother develop a sudden migraine. Mention a school play and watch my father check a watch he wasn't wearing. It wasn't rage I could have fought. It was policy. Smooth, unanimous, enforced entirely through silence. So the porch didn't shock me. The earthquake just did what earthquakes do, it found a crack that already existed and dragged it into daylight where the whole street could see it. What I still couldn't explain to Ren, or to myself, was why after 9 years of 1-chair dinners I had kept showing up at that house with a toolbox in my hand. Because here's the part I'm not proud of, for 9 years I had been that house's entire maintenance plan. Clogged gutters, I climbed the ladder. My father's tangled tax paperwork after he left the plant, I sat at their table with a calculator while a paid sitter watched Ren at home. My mother's heart medication, sorted into a weekly organizer every month, because that's what nurse daughters do. And in a drawer in my apartment, in an envelope marked roof, I had $5,200, 3 years of skipped haircuts and picked up overtime shifts, saved because their shingles were curling and my father refused to spend the money, and I decided I would fix it before the rains came. Nobody asked me to. That's the clinical picture, if you want it plainly. I believed that if I stayed useful long enough, the debt would eventually come due in my favor. That one Sunday there would simply be 2 chairs, no conversation required, the way rules soften for people who've finally earned it. My patient Eleanor Voss saw the truth of it before I did. 72, widowed, a stubborn heart and 11 acres north of town, and I'd been checking her vitals 3 evenings a week for going on 4 years. Twice she'd offered me the empty apartment over her barn, vacated when her son moved to Denver. Twice I'd said no, smiling, using Ren as the excuse, better to stay close to my folks. Even that week, with my entire life inside a condemned building, that sentence still felt safer to say out loud than the truth underneath it. That refusal turned out to be the most expensive sentence I ever spoke. I'd learn exactly what it cost within 72 hours. The shelter smelled like floor wax and instant coffee, Cots in rows under faded basketball banners, 100-some people trying to be polite about snoring. Wren claimed a cot along the wall and lined her stones up on the pillow, smallest to largest, her own private form of triage. I did what I always do in a room full of need, found the volunteer table and put my hands to work. Water bottles, blood pressure checks for the diabetics in the crowd. Sitting still with my own thoughts felt more dangerous than any aftershock. Around 9, a woman named Carol Weiss came through pushing a cart of donated blankets, the pastor's wife, kind-eyed, the sort of person who knows every family's business by instinct. She spotted Wren's cot, then me, and I watched her do the arithmetic she was too polite to say out loud. "Nora Ashford," she said carefully. "Aren't Dale and Miriam just up on Larch?" "They are," I said, and offered nothing else. I was raised to keep family matters behind the fence, and old training dies hard. She patted my arm and moved on with her blankets. But I felt something click into motion, the small, quiet machinery of a town where who sleeps where after a disaster becomes public record, and my mother's name was now attached to 2 separate addresses on that record. I didn't sleep that first night. Around midnight I sat up and turned my keyring over in the exit sign light. Work key. Car key. Mailbox key for a building nobody could enter. And the brass one, worn smooth at the shoulder, the key to 118, Larch Avenue, on my ring since I was 17. I'd used it 1,000 times, almost never for myself. Let myself in to water plants while they vacationed. Let myself in with soup during my father's bout of shingles. Let myself in last spring to fix the garbage disposal while they were at church, so my mother could come home to a working sink and no obligation to say thank you. 19 years of that key, and my daughter had never once slept behind the door it opened. I looked at Wren, asleep with one hand resting on her stone tin, and remembered the promise I'd made her in the hospital on day 1, staring at an empty visitor's chair. She will never feel like a guest in her own family. I had kept that promise everywhere except the one place it mattered most, and the earthquake had just put the failure in writing. So in the dark, in a gym that smelled like other people's hard luck, I opened the envelope marked roof and counted it by feel. $5,200. Money I'd saved to hold their house together. In the morning, I made 2 calls. My mother would hear about the first one within the hour. She wouldn't understand the size of the second one until the third night, the call that changed everything. The quiet call went to Eleanor Voss at 7 a.m., before I could talk myself out of it. "Is the apartment over the barn still empty?" A pause, then that dry voice of hers. "Been empty 2 years. Hasn't grown legs. You finally asking?" I was finally asking. We did it properly, because I don't take favors I can't stand under. First month, last month, deposit, the full $5,200, and on top of it I'd take over her evening care off the clock, vitals and medication, trade for trade, farm rules. She said she'd have taken less. I said I know, that's exactly why it's the full amount. She laughed like a screen door swinging and told me the key would be under the flower pot, which in her language means welcome home. The other call went to my supervisor, asking to cash in my banked leave. By 8:30, the machinery I'd felt turning the night before had already made its first full rotation. Carol Weiss, doing shelter intake, had mentioned, kindly, the way knives are sometimes kind, that poor Nora Ashford and her little girl had spent the night on cots at the high school. And kindness like that travels fast through a small town's prayer chain, straight through my mother's kitchen. When I woke Wren, she asked where we were going, and I knelt to her level the way I do with frightened patients and told her the truth. "We're going to a farm. Our own place." She studied me with those serious brown eyes. "Because Grandma has no space." "Baby," I said, "we don't beg for rooms. We build them." I heard about my mother's morning secondhand, through my cousin Renee, who still attends services there and narrates everything like play-by-play. Carol Weiss had called out of genuine concern. "Miriam, honey, I saw Nora and the baby at the shelter, is everything all right?" And my mother, without missing a beat, "Oh, the girls are fine. Nora has plenty of options. You know this generation, it's practically camping over there." Camping. My daughter, sleeping on a canvas cot under a scoreboard, a 15-minute drive from her grandmother's guest room. And the official family position was that we were roughing it for fun. Renee asked if she should say something. I told her no, And meant it, because this is the part people get wrong about women like my mother. I never needed to fight her in public. Her whole life was a performance for an audience I'd stopped performing for years ago. A performance like that doesn't need an enemy to collapse. It just needs time, and one audience member with working eyes. Carol Weiss had working eyes. She'd seen the cots herself. So when my mother said plenty of options in that bright hostess voice, something didn't sit right, the way a wrong lab value doesn't sit right with me. And lies in a town like Millbrook are exactly like cracks in a load-bearing wall. You can paint over them. Hang a picture in front of them. But the building always knows, and the building always tells eventually. All I had to do was keep living where people could see me clearly. That afternoon brought my second escorted entry, 15 minutes, one inspector, everything two people could carry. Neighbors showed up in pickup trucks without being asked. A man from the corner deli carried Ren's mattress on his back like it weighed nothing. Priya boxed my kitchen on her lunch break with the speed of a woman who'd done this before. 15 minutes isn't much of a life, but it turns out the parts that matter fit in a truck bed, beds, books, one good skillet, a tin of stones. We were loading the last box when I saw the blue pickup. My father's truck, coming down Delaney Street slower than I'd ever seen him drive anything. 68 years old, 40 years at the electric company, a man who can rewire a house but not a sentence. He didn't stop. He slowed just enough to see the mattress, the boxes, his granddaughter cradling a lamp, then raised two fingers off the wheel in a farmer's wave and kept driving. He waved like a man apologizing through glass. Ren waved back, because she's 9 and generous and doesn't yet know a wave can be a coward's signature. Priya watched the truck turn at the light and muttered something I won't repeat. I filed it away, the slowing, the white-knuckled grip, the refusal to stop the way I file a symptom that hasn't fully declared itself yet. Something was shifting in my father. Some slow, tectonic thing. I remember thinking, with no idea how literal it would become, whatever that is, it's going to take a bigger shake to bring it down. Our second night at the shelter was supposed to be our last. The gas company couldn't relight Eleanor's pilot light until morning, quake protocol, no exceptions. It was also the night Ren spiked a low fever, nothing dramatic, just the kind of burn kids run when their whole world has shifted twice in 3 days. The shelter's volunteer nurse had gone homesick, so I spent the night doing double duty, cool cloths for my daughter, blood pressure cuffs for half the senior citizens in the building. Around 1 a.m., wringing out a washcloth, I heard my mother's voice in my head, uninvited and clear as a bell. There's no space for her. You can be bone-tired and still feel a sentence like that travel up your spine. The woman on the next cot, small and sharp-eyed, nodded at Ren. You're the Ashford girl. The nurse. I was, I said. Shame what that family did to your Aunt Ruth, she said, easy as commenting on the weather. Beautiful hands, that woman. Used to sew for half the church. I kept wringing the washcloth, but everything in me went still. I don't have an Aunt Ruth. 35 years in this family, every holiday, every funeral, every photo album, and there was no Ruth in any of it. The woman saw my face and closed up like a coin purse, suddenly fascinated by her blanket. I checked Ren's forehead, cooler now, and lay back down with my mind running hotter than my daughter's fever. My family had a missing person in it, and I'd never once heard her name. I called my mother the next morning from the shelter parking lot, watching Ren eat a donated muffin in the passenger seat. First time we'd spoken since the porch, and I didn't waste it on small talk. Mom. Who's Ruth? The silence on the line had texture, like a room where something just broke and everyone's waiting to see who moves first. Where did you hear that name? She said. Not a question. A diagnosis. A woman at the shelter mentioned her. We don't talk about that. A period you could hear. Then, smooth as a hostess pivoting a conversation, Carol tells me you've found somewhere to stay. I think that's for the best, don't you? For the best. I stood in a parking lot full of donated blankets and nearly laughed. My homeless daughter, for the best. My $5,200, for the best. But I've drawn blood from combative patients before I know when to stop pushing a needle. I said goodbye and hung up, holding two facts. 1. Somewhere out there was a woman named Ruth, erased so completely that 35 years of my life had never bumped into her. 2. Whatever she'd done to earn that erasure, an old woman at a shelter called it a shame, not a scandal. And in my family, shame only ever flows downhill, onto the women. I had a feeling I already knew the shape of Ruth's crime. We moved into the barn apartment that morning. Knotty pine walls, a window over the sink facing the north pasture, 2 bedrooms. 2. When Wren understood the second one was hers, she walked its perimeter like a small surveyor, then set her stone tin on the windowsill dead center, with the ceremony of a flag planting. The gas man relit the pilot at 8. By noon the place smelled like coffee and pine sap, and I stood in my own kitchen, mine, rented, earned, no conditions attached, and slid the brass key off my ring. It weighed nothing. It weighed everything. I sealed it in a plain envelope and wrote one line on the front, because there was no letter inside, no speech, no scorched earth goodbye. You'll need this more than I will. Eleanor was driving into town that afternoon for her pharmacy run, and she'd been waiting years to be useful to me the way I'd been useful to everyone else. I asked her to put it directly into my mother's hand, not the mailbox. Wren wandered in while I was sealing the flap, because children can smell a ritual forming. Is that Grandma's key? Are we giving it back? I ran my thumb over the envelope one last time. We're giving back what was never really ours, baby. She thought about that the way she thinks about a new stone, turning it over, testing the weight, then nodded and went back to her windowsill. That first night in the apartment, I cooked in my own skillet on my own stove, and Wren ate 2 bowls and told me the pasture smelled like horses, even though Eleanor hadn't kept horses in a decade. My parents' silence had always felt like a held breath. This quiet was just quiet, crickets, the hum of the fridge, my daughter's fork against her plate. After she fell asleep under the jacket she now refused to give back, I sat on the little landing outside with a cup of tea and did something I hadn't done since the ground first moved. Nothing. No lists. No calls. No fixing. If you've ever handed back something you spent years earning, a key, a name, a seat at somebody's table, you know exactly how that porch felt. Eleanor delivered the envelope that Friday afternoon and gave me the full report at her evening checkup, narrating like a woman who'd been saving it up all day. She'd found my mother behind the donation table at First Baptist, running the relief effort like a field marshal in a Sunday blouse. Eleanor walked up, said "From your daughter," and placed the envelope in her hand. Your mother smiled that hostess smile, Eleanor said, right up until she felt the shape of what was inside. Then she read the line on the front and went, in Eleanor's words, the color of my good tablecloth, white, with a pattern of panic. The first words out of Miriam Ashford, in the middle of a church fellowship hall, were not "Is my daughter all right?" They were, "What did she tell you?" Eleanor, 72 and unshakable, looked her dead in the eye. Nothing, Miriam. She didn't have to. Family is whoever shows up with a casserole and no conditions attached. Then she took her prescription bag and walked out, leaving my mother holding 19 years of brass. A woman like my mother can survive almost anything except a question she can't control the answer to. The counterattack arrived that same night, headlights swinging up the farm road as I came back in from Eleanor's. A church van, a cardboard box addressed in my mother's careful cursive, "For Wren, with love, Grandma," delivered not quietly to our door, but logged through the church relief system, blessed in public. My cousin Renee called before the van had even left the lot. Her mother had watched Miriam pack the box at the depot table, narrating for the room how her granddaughter had been displaced, how the family was doing all it could. I opened it at the kitchen table while Wren hovered, because a 9-year-old who has never once received a gift from her grandmother does not hover casually. Inside, a winter coat sized for a 4-year-old. Wren wears a girl's size 10. 2 summer dresses, wrong season, tags from a clearance rack 3 years stale. A picture book Bible for toddlers. A stuffed rabbit with a crushed ear, the kind of thing that sits in a donation bin, not a toy store. Not one item in that box would fit, warm, or interest the actual child whose name was on the label. Because the box was never for the child. It was for the sign-in sheet. A receipt, purchased in public, proving Miriam Ashford had done all she could. Wren lifted the tiny coat and held it against herself, and her expression wasn't hurt, it was worse than hurt. It was arithmetic. She was calculating her own size inside her grandmother's imagination. "Grandma thinks I'm still little," she said, quiet and factual. I packed the box back up with steady hands. The next morning, the ground moved again. Saturday, 6:40 a.m., 3 days after the porch. I was measuring coffee when the floor kicked, sharper this time. Mina. A 5.0, the radio would call it, centered east of town. The pine walls popped like knuckles. Wren's stones danced off the windowsill, and she was in my arms before the shaking finished. Farm damage was minor, one cracked window, a shelf of preserves shattered on the floor. But the radio told the rest. The aftershock had thrown its weight east, straight through the neighborhoods where my parents lived. Power out. Chimneys down. Crews dispatched to Larch, to Miller Road, to a dozen streets just like theirs. I stood in my dry, upright kitchen with the radio hissing, my thumb finding the bare spot on my keyring where a brass key used to sit, and rubbed it once like a phantom limb. I want to be honest, I didn't feel satisfaction. You can cut a rope and still feel it snap somewhere down in your own chest, where the anchor used to be. My phone lit up on the counter. Mom. First call since we don't talk about that. I let it ring twice before answering. Nora. Your father fell. I was already moving for my bag as she talked, some part of me shifting into gear automatically. The story came in pieces, the shaking, a chunk of chimney through the porch roof, my father running for the hallway in the dark, catching the edge of a table on his way down. Blood. Head blood, she said, so much blood. I told her scalps bleed like liars, it's their job. Every ambulance in the county was tied up on priority calls, and a conscious 68-year-old with a scalp wound and a hurt wrist was hours down the list. The ER said watch him or wait. Then my mother said the sentence I'd been waiting 19 years to hear, though never like this. I didn't know who else to call. There it was. Not I was wrong. Not come home. The truth, by accident. When the lights go out, the person you call is the person you should have made room for all along. Keep him still and keep him talking, I said. I'm on my way. Eleanor took Wren without being asked twice. Go. We'll make pancakes. She can supervise. I was halfway down the stairs when Wren called after me, steady in that new voice she'd grown all week, handing my own sentence back to me like a canteen before a march. We don't beg for rooms, Mommy. Go help. Come back whole. Some kids inherit money. Mine inherited a spine. I turned onto Larch Avenue as the sun cleared the roofline, and there it was, the house with no space for my daughter, standing crooked for the first time in its life, front door hanging open. My father was on the hallway floor, a couch cushion under his head, a dish towel pressed to his scalp, the same towel, I'd swear, he'd been holding useless in that doorway 3 days earlier, finally given a job. My mother hovered over him, hands doing that helpless fluttering thing. I knelt, gloved up, and went to work. The scalp laceration was ragged but shallow, bled dramatically, as scalps do, but the skull beneath it was sound. Pupils equal and reactive. He knew his name, the date, and that he was embarrassed, which is actually a decent neurological sign. The wrist was swollen and tender, likely a sprain, possibly hairline. I splinted it, iced it, narrated everything in my flattest clinical voice. This will be cold, look at my finger, squeeze my hand, and both my parents obeyed like children. That's the part nobody warns you about in medicine, how quickly the power in a room shifts the moment you walk in wearing gloves. When I finished taping the dressing, my father looked up at me, eyes wet, and said, rough as gravel, you came. I heard the hallway go silent behind me, my mother holding her breath, both of them waiting to see which version of me had shown up, the daughter or the nurse. I checked his pupils one last time and told the truth, I'm a nurse. This is what we do. Behind me, barely louder than the dying refrigerator, my mother said, 2 hours ago I didn't think anyone was coming at all. We settled my father on the couch, wrist splintered and elevated. My mother did the only thing Miriam Ashford knows how to do with shaking hands. She made tea, matches trembling against the striker 3 times before catching. Her fortress was melting at room temperature, casserole dishes stacked by the sink from neighbors checking on neighbors, and for one unguarded moment I saw something I'd never once witnessed at that address, a 63-year-old woman who genuinely did not know what to do next. Then she found her old road again. People have been asking about you at church, you know. I do hope you haven't been discussing family matters. I said nothing. I've stood at enough bedsides to know that silence outlasts any argument ever spoken. I let hers hang there until the words family matters and the memory of a shelter cot and a bleeding man on the couch all sat in the same dark room together, and her voice ran out of road, and her chin dropped a centimeter. That's when the knock came. Carol Weiss, at the screen door with candles and a casserole, looking straight down the hall at me elbow deep in my father's care. She stood there maybe 90 seconds, and in small-town accounting that's a full audit. She saw the splint. The dressing. My open bag on the coffee table. My mother in yesterday's cardigan. You could watch the ledger reconciling behind her kind eyes. The girls are fine, plenty of options, practically camping against the very visible arithmetic of the daughter from the shelter cots kneeling in this dark house doing the work of an ER. She said nothing about any of it. Church women of a certain age can conduct an entire trial without a single audible word. Dale, you're in the best hands in this county, she said, and left. The screen door hadn't finished swinging shut before my mother came apart at the one seam I should have predicted. Not thank God your father's all right. Not what do we owe you. She pressed her fingers to her mouth and said, now the whole church will know we told you no. The knock that mattered came late that afternoon, except it wasn't a knock at all. It was a car idling too long at the curb. An old sedan, a woman behind the wheel looking at the house the way you look at a dog that bit you decades ago. I watched her through the window a full minute before she got out. Silver braid, pressed slacks, somewhere near 70, and something in the shape of her face I recognized instantly, because I'd seen it across my own breakfast table my whole life. She came up the walk slowly. I stepped onto the porch to meet her. She looked at me and pressed a hand to her chest. Lord. You stand just like my mother did. That's how I met my Aunt Ruth Calloway, 68, of a town 2 hours south, who'd heard about the aftershock on the radio and driven straight over to look at a house she hadn't stood inside since 1974, when she was 17 and 6 weeks pregnant, and her own mother had set 2 suitcases on this exact porch while the church called it strength. She told me the rest in one flat sentence, the way you hand over something too heavy to unwrap slowly. 49 years. A whole erased woman. My mother had been 12, watching from the upstairs window, the same window I'd stood at as a child myself. Ruth looked past me down the hall, where my mother had gone perfectly still, teacup in hand, and my aunt didn't step inside. She stayed exactly on the boards where the suitcases had once sat and said quietly, for the whole house to hear, 49 years ago, there was no space for me either. Same doorway. Different girl. Down the hall, porcelain clinked a cup set down with 2 shaking hands. I made my decision on that porch. Dad needs checks every 2 hours tonight, I said. I'm staying till morning. As his nurse. Ruth left before supper. I've seen what I came to see, she said, and it isn't the chimney. The house settled into its first honest dark night in 49 years of order. I did my father's checks at 8, at 10, at midnight, pupils, grip, orientation, his big weathered hand squeezing mine on command and holding a half-second past what the exam required, every single time. At 2 in the morning I was at the kitchen table by candlelight, charting his vitals in my notebook, when the stairs creaked and my mother came down in her robe, carrying the envelope. You'll need this more than I will. She set it between us like evidence and, for a long stretch, the only sound was the candle. Then she talked, and none of it came out managed. It came out like something finally lanced. She'd been 12 the night her sister left, watched from the stairwell window, the suitcases, the porch light, Ruth's coat wrong for the weather. On Sunday, their mother walked into church with her chin high, and the congregation received her like a war widow. Strong woman. Righteous woman. Did what had to be done. They praised her, my mother said, staring into the flame. For 20 years I watched them praise her for it. I learned the rules like scripture, Nora. I thought if I kept them perfectly, the rules would keep me. I sat very still, the way you do when a patient finally tells you exactly where it hurts. Understanding isn't the same thing as absolution. It's just a better diagnosis. Then she opened the envelope, took out the brass key, reached across the table, and pressed it into my palm with both hands, like she was sealing a wound. Come home, she said. Both of you. Ren can have my old room, the one with the window. It was always going to be half yours anyway. From the dark hallway, my father's voice, thick and certain, the first full sentence he'd volunteered in 3 days. She means it. Come home. Understand what sat in my hand. Not just brass. The room with the window. Pancake mornings. My daughter, finally, on the inside of that door. The exact dream I'd been making payments on for 9 straight years, delivered whole and warm that very night. Every version of me that had ever climbed their ladder or filled their pillbox stood up at once inside my chest and reached for it. Then, from the garage stairs, I heard my daughter's voice in my memory. We don't beg for rooms, Mommy. There was one question left. I opened my hand so the key lay flat between us in the candlelight, and I asked it as quietly as taking a pulse. If the earthquake hadn't cracked your chimney, Mom, if the church hadn't seen us on those cots, would Ren have a room in this house tonight? The candle ticked. The refrigerator dripped into its pan. My father, on the couch, stopped breathing loud enough to hear. And my mother opened her mouth, and I watched her search for the yes. Her whole face reached for it the way a falling woman reaches for a railing, and she could not find it, because we were sitting at a truth table at 2 a.m, with witnesses she couldn't manage, her husband, her daughter, and herself. The silence went 1 second past bearable. Then another. Her eyes filled. Her chin dropped. That was the answer. No. Without the disaster, no. Without the audience, no. I felt relief, terrible, clean relief, because for 19 years I'd believed there was a price I simply hadn't found yet, some final chore that would unlock that house. There had never been a price. There had only been weather. I closed my hand around the key one last time, then set it down on the table between the 2 teacups. Here's what I can give you, I said, my voice landing the way it does over a hospital bed, low, even, load-bearing. I'll stay till morning. I'll check Dad every 2 hours. When you're sick, I'll come. When the pipes freeze, call me. That's the daughter you raised, she doesn't quit on people. But my daughter is 9 years old, and she has spent her whole life watching this family decide whether she's a condition to be managed. She will never sleep in a house where she's a condition. Not this one. Not anyone's. I nodded at the key lying on the wood. So no, Mom. We're not coming home. We are home. Nobody moved. I'll be honest about the cost, because this story doesn't get to sell anyone a fairy tale. On the porch, she had taken something from me. At that table, I gave it up myself, the room with the window, half of everything, 9 years of hoping, returned to her with my own steady hands. There's no version of that which doesn't cost something. My mother looked at the key, then at me, and whispered, "Is this because of the shelter?" "Because the church knows." She still couldn't see it. "It's because you never once asked her size, Mom. 9 years, and you never asked her size." She began to cry, the kind that comes up from deep storage, not the tidy kind. I didn't go around the table to hold her. Maybe you think I should have. But I'd spent 19 years supplying every ounce of comfort in that house, and this grief was hers to sit inside of. The kindest thing I could do was not rescue her from the first honest weather of her entire life. "There was never enough space," she said into her hands. "Your grandmother. The church. This town. You don't know what it takes to keep a family looking right." There was the whole disease, in one sentence. I gave her back the cure in one of my own. "You never ran out of space, Mom. You ran out of nerve." She flinched like I'd touched an open wound, because I had. I left at first light. Before I did, I sat at the table one last time and wrote a care sheet in block print: wound care, splint schedule, warning signs, when to force an ER visit whether he liked it or not, and taped it to the refrigerator with my cell number underneath, marked for real emergencies. My mother stood at the counter watching me tape it up, cardigan buttoned one hole off, and I didn't fix it for her. The key stayed on the table, exactly where I'd set it, ringed in dried candle wax. She wouldn't put it back in the drawer, because putting it away meant admitting something. My father couldn't pick it up, because picking it up meant deciding something. So it just lay there in the grey morning light, a house key belonging to no one, in a 4-bedroom house with 2 people and no space, and nobody young enough left to fill it. 6 weeks now. FEMA rental assistance came through and covers a fair share of the farm rent, which Eleanor grumbles about accepting and takes anyway. Ren's school reopened after 2 weeks of inspections. She rides a bus that stops at the end of the farm road and has informed every child on it that she lives on a ranch with 2 horses, which is entirely false, and I have not corrected the record. My father's splint came off at week 5. He's driven out here twice since, no phone call first. The first time, he sat in his truck in the yard for 10 full minutes while Eleanor and I watched through the window like 2 hens deciding whether a fish was going to move. Then he got out, found the sagging gate on the chicken run, and rebuilt it without being asked, drank 1 glass of lemonade standing up, said well, and left. The second visit, he fixed the porch light and let Ren hand him the tools, naming each one for her: flathead, Phillips, the little talks like an electrician's catechism. She recited them back like state capitals. He hasn't said the word sorry. He's 68. The word might not survive the trip up. But tools are a language, and he's speaking it as fast as his hands allow. My mother hasn't come. Church sources report she's admitted nothing, resigned nothing, chairs everything, same cardigan armor as always. Though Renee mentions that at the last potluck, when someone started a sentence about my situation, Miriam Ashford excused herself to refill a pitcher that was already full. Sunday dinners happen at the farm now. Nobody planned it, it simply accreted the way real families do. Eleanor at the head of the table because it's her farmhouse and her pot roast. Priya and her husband when shifts allow. Ren doing homework between serving bowls, stones lined up by the napkins, explaining sedimentary versus igneous to anyone slow enough to get caught listening. And once a month, driving up with a pie and a seamstress's posture, my Aunt Ruth. We don't do speeches, she and I. She hems Ren's school pants. I check her blood pressure. 2 women, the same doorway, 49 years apart, passing the butter. Eleanor looked down that table one night and delivered the verdict like she was reading a meter. Family is whoever shows up with a casserole and no conditions attached. Nobody argued. Then, the first cold Saturday in November, Ren came pounding up the stairs holding a mason jar like it was a moon rock. Someone had left a box on the bottom step, no note, no knock, would have heard a knock. Inside, 6 jars of home-canned peaches. On each lid, in careful, terrified cursive I've known my whole life, for Ren. Not for Nora and Ren. For Ren. 9 years late, and small enough to fit on a jar lid, I'm sorry, spelled the only way my mother's generation was ever taught to spell it. I stood on that landing a long time holding the jar. Then I handed it to my daughter and let her decide, because that's the entire point of everything, isn't it? She studied the lid. Studied me. Then she opened it at Sunday dinner and passed it around the table, starting with Ruth. Grandma makes good peaches, she announced. And that was all. And that was everything. We don't beg for rooms. We build them. We did. Here's the one thing I'd carve over every door I own. I spent 19 years trying to earn a place in a house that measured love by what the neighbors could see. It took an earthquake to teach me that home was never the place with a spare room waiting for you. It's the place where your child is never treated as a condition. That's my story. 1 earthquake. 1 key, returned twice. And a farmhouse table with room for everyone who shows up without conditions attached. If someone ever made your child feel like a footnote in their own family, you're not alone, and you were never wrong for walking. Tell me in the comments what you built after somebody told you there was no space for you.